Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Ultimate Growth Experience podcast. So this is my third book review. Today I have a book by Professor John J. Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. The book is called The Great Delusion. Now, I'm sure a lot of people know John already because he is a really well-known international relations scholar alongside Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington for their post-Cold War geopolitical theories. So obviously Professor Huntington wrote the book Clash of Civilizations, and also Frank Fukuyama wrote the famous article and book The End of History and The Last Man, which is now known as a political meme at uni at the moment. But John's new book is mainly about why American foreign policy needs to return to realism and also restrain their policies. And the reason is historically and empirically clear to me. A lot of liberal internationalists and neoconservatives may disagree with me, but I think it's pretty clear. So John starts off with a few different sections. He starts off by talking about political liberalism as a theory, and also he goes through people like John Rawls. He goes through people like Steven Pinker and Frank Fukuyama as to how he calls them the idealistic liberals. And then he also talks about progressive liberalism, like the New Deal, like the Great Frontier under John F. Kennedy. And he also goes through the differences between different theorists, such as, John Stuart Mill, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Niccolo Machiavelli, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And his analysis of liberal, so he means liberal in the Lockean sense. So, there is both Republican and Democrats are both liberals in the sense that they believe in liberal democratic principles. So liberalism within that is the idea of spreading this so-called Lockean liberalism overseas. And this is where the liberal internationalists and neoconservatives become a unified foreign policy ideology. Now John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer, is a offensive realist. So offensive realism is the idea that nation states will be at conflict or be in intense security competition to strive for power. So he's a neo-realist, which is the main theoretical assumption, and neo-realism and defensive realism are the two different neo-realist theories. It's quite complicated. But realists mainly believe in the idea of the balance of power, and also the idea that nation-states should be treated like black boxes. They are morally neutral. There are no good guys or there are no bad guys. This is the idea that nation-states will conduct each other based on the principle by using alliances, cooperation, geopolitical strategy, and also even alliances to conduct war and foreign policy with each other. A classic realist from back in the day is George Kennan's theory of containment, to contain the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which is why George Marshall initiated the Marshall Plan into Western Europe. Another historical example was when the Soviet Union and the United States decided to ally with each other to attack against Nazi Germany. It was a weird alliance, but it had to be done because two powers means they can overcome the nasty National Socialist power. And that's realism. So that's ism number one. There are three isms. Ism number two, which I mentioned briefly, is liberalism. Liberals believe in the idea that there are good guys and bad guys, and that we have to do everything we can to protect our liberal democratic principles and spread it overseas. So John mentions Madeleine Albright, who is a card-carrying liberal, paraphrased, who mentions that America is the indispensable nation and that we should do everything we can, we as in Americans, should spread our values overseas. So she's a liberal. Now, John, he goes from liberalism, explaining the origins of liberalism by mentioning theorists, like I mentioned, Locke, all the way to Rousseau. But also within that, he talks about the origins as to why liberalism fails later on. Now, liberalism believes in institutions like the United Nations, the idea of the democratic peace theory, perpetual peace under Immanuel Kant, and also this idealistic, this social constructionist view of foreign policy. Liberals like Robert Keohane, Joseph Nye, and these people all believe in this key concept that institutions can bind each other and that democracies do not fight each other. This was the justification of neoconservatives and liberal internationalists when they justified the Iraq War, when they justified intervening in Afghanistan, and also in Libya in 2011. So liberals believe mainly in interconnectedness, world trade, and spreading liberal democracy overseas. And within liberalism, this was where NATO expansion led to Russian antagonism or defense. John believes that NATO expansion was what led to the Crimean crisis. I am not really sure about that, but he does make a relatively compelling case. Now, the third ism I will mention, I hope I covered liberal internationalism and liberalism and realism relatively okay. The third ism that he mentions a lot is nationalism. John believes that human beings are social animals and that we are tribal from the get-go. Thomas Hobbes stated that we, as human beings, our lives, without the Leviathan, is nasty, brutish, and short. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated that human beings with institutions are inherently corrupt, and so therefore, within the state of nature, Rousseau believed that human beings were noble, romantic, and idealistic and lovely. I do not agree with Jean-Jacques Rousseau at all. I believe more in the idea of what Hobbes said about human beings. But John states that they are both wrong, and that we are social animals, and that we survived by unifying with our tribes and binding together. And this is why he believes that nationalism today, within the international system, is why nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. For instance, at the moment, Vietnam and China, despite having similar political ideologies, they are both run by supposed communist countries, communist governments, and yet they do not like each other. And in fact, Vietnam is a de facto ally with the United States. So John believes this democratic peace theory is wrong, and he believes that as a realist, we need to look at international relations within a non-moral-based perspective. We need to look at countries like black boxes and look at it within power, as in the power of the nation, the economic, the military, political power. So this is why John makes it clear in his book, The Great Delusion, that we need to have a more of a restrained foreign policy. The invasion in Iraq was a failure. It led to ISIS taking over the vacuum. In terms of Libya, it was a catastrophic failure. And John was also very critical of Angela Merkel in the idea that because this inherent human nature of nationalism is so powerful, this is why John believes that Brexit was created because of nationalist sentiment. The idea that Brussels runs the state affairs within London, or the idea that the United Nations or New York controls a lot of other affairs, was why people were so fed up and they're moving away from globalization. And this is very interesting. This binds in towards democratic, domestic politics and also international politics, but it's mainly about international relations. Yeah, he's saying that Americans need to stop intervening in countries, they need to stop bombing and knocking off autocratic regime, toppling off dictators and trying to spread democracy. And in fact, John talks about the failures of the Bush Doctrine, because George Bush, in the aftermath of World War One, 9/11. He wanted to create a democratic peace zone in the Middle East by toppling each dictator. So along the trade line, Saddam Hussein was number one, then Bashar al-Assad from Syria, and then after that, Iran, etc. And John's like, why are we doing this? this is not going to help us. And in fact, we should be focusing more on building out infrastructure, helping our kids get better education, and focus on improving the health of Americans. And his point is very clear, right? And in relation to this, John believes that the liberal international order was dead from the get-go because we are heading towards a multipolar system. And in fact, he's probably right. China is continuing to rise. They are building their Belt and Road Initiative across Central Asia and all the way to Europe. And also Russia is regaining its power, so Americans will have to return to realpolitik anyway. They cannot continue this idea of liberal hegemony. And in fact, Professor Mearsheimer mentions that Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony, even though liberal hegemony might rein him in and make him more of a liberal foreign policy guy, but you don't know. We don't know. It's unpredictable, and that's why I said in my previous video about Trump that he might win in 2020. But the main point of this book is the idea that the American foreign policy establishment need to wake up and understand that the reality at the moment is very different to when the Americans won the Cold War in the 1990s. So ladies and gentlemen, this book is very good, and I recommend everybody who are international relation nerds like me should have a read of this. I hope to read more liberal international relations books, but this is really good too. As a realist, I'm sure you know how I feel about this. I had the honor of meeting Professor Mearsheimer from Sydney, obviously, if you watched my previous videos. But yeah, good read. Have a look at it. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you guys very soon in my next podcast. Take care and have a good night. Bye-bye.